Okay, so with that, we will get things underway and hand over to Cristina and Cynthia, and if we could welcome all our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for your kind introduction. Thank you also to Sarah Turner, Ella Fleming, Kathleen Ward, and the entire team of the Paul Mellon Center for making this event possible. Many thanks also to Esther Chadwick and the contributors Hannah, Sheila, Tim, Nick, and Paris, as well as to Lou McKeever for being here today and everyone who took the time to join us. It is a great honor for us to be at the Paul Mellon Center tonight. Why are we here? To share the story of collaborative research and engage everyone in the room and online to think about what we collectively produced, why it matters, and what remains to be done.
So our book is foremost a collaboration and an aggregate of research of all the contributors from their unique perspectives and expertise. And the genesis of the project was also collaborative. So my first encounter with my co-editor and co-conspirator, Cristina Martinez, was in 2012 to 2013 when she came to the Lewis Walpole Library as a fellow to do research on art and law. And we shared interests that sparked lively conversations, especially as we were motivated by an injustice, we thought, that Jane Hogarth's biography in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography was underneath as a subsection to that of her husband, William. We didn't like that. So today, I can tell you that Cristina has corrected that, and Jane Hogarth now has an independent entry in the dictionary. So I also had a longstanding interest in the gendered histories of printmaking by noble women and the implications of female genius in the arts, as Horace Walpole conceived it. And what role did gender play? So we had lots of questions, and we wondered how many other women printmakers and print trade entrepreneurs needed to be brought to the fore. So we wanted to find and tell their stories and to foster the research to do so.
So the next step was to organize a conference panel to find others who had the same or similar research questions. The panel, The Imprint of Women, Printmakers, Printsellers, and Print Publishers at the American Society for 18th Century Studies, ASEX, took place in Orlando, Florida on 23rd March 2018, 7 years ago. We had 4 panelists: Kelsey D. Martin, Heather McPherson, Paris A. Spice Gans, and Amy Tobert. All 4 ended up contributing to the book.
So there was a lot of energy in the room. I don't know if you noticed in Cristina's slide, but it was packed. So we got really excited, and it seemed like a book project was an inevitable next step to address questions and to prompt more research. And so, of course, Cristina, who is the mover and shaker of our team, went straight to the publisher's exhibit hall and found Bethany Thomas at Cambridge University Press. Sarah's laughing because she knows how this works. And we had a book. So we needed a larger cohort of researchers. And we invited scholars who we knew. We leveraged networks to see others, who could write about women. And we did focus just on pictorial printmaking, excluding press, letter engravers, and people who did maps. We felt like we needed to manage it somehow. But it was also really important to us. I heard someone say, it's a great crowd, but there's only women in the room. But that's not entirely true. But we were very happy to have male authors contribute to our book as well. Anyway. And then one reviewer suggested that 15 essays needed some structure. 15 essays is quite a lot. And we actually had a couple more, but lots of reasons. The essays themselves naturally divided into 3 thematic categories, which became the 3 sections for the volume. And you see them on the screen. So I'm going to do a really quick race through the sections, and Cristina as well, and just to give a sense of what's included with a focus on what the research strategies and expertise of each of the contributors were. So part 1 includes 4 chapters on prints as self-preservation and self-promotion. Chapter 1 sets the stage with Madeline Verhoeven's work on women self-fashioning through prints. Thank you. That embrace gender transgressions even at the risk of backlash. And her examples begin circa 1700 with Anna Maria van Sherman, Maria de Wilde, and Angelica Kaufman. Next, Paris B. Scantz writes about Maria Causeway's printmaking and publishing, and Paris takes her expertise from many years of research for her award-winning book, lots of award-winning books tonight, A Revolution in Art, The Rise of Women Artists in Britain and France, 1760 to 1830. And Paris is speaking at the National Gallery tomorrow night, if anybody doesn't know yet, wants to go. Let's see. Chapter 3, Heather McPherson tackles Caroline Watson's professional achievement in commercial reproductive prints after narrative painting and celebrity performers. And she suggests that while little is known about Watson's life, the prints themselves, which were signed unusually for a woman at the time, provided evidence for her exceptional ambition. Chapter 4, drawing on his extensive knowledge of German printmakers from a long career in the art market, where people see way more than some of the rest of us do. Carlo Schmidt describes the long neglected graphic work of 3 women from German-speaking countries. Kaufman and Ellenreiter, he argues, used prints to spread their own fame, while Prestel worked in her husband's studio shop focusing on interpretive prints of drawings and new media. Part 2 has 5 chapters organized around the spaces of production. In Chapter 5, Hannah Lyons finds evidence in both the archives and the work produced to give a broad account of the centrality of family and home workshop and the intersections of commercial and domestic responsibilities in late 18th century London. And we'll hear more from Hannah later. Chapter 6, Kelsey Martin focuses on women printmaking for the art market in 18th century Paris, narrating about the training in family workshops and independent collaborations beyond the family atelier. In Chapter 7, Rena Hoisington's research is highly object-based, and despite a dearth of historical record in the absence of Catherine Elizabeth Quesnay's in art historical narratives, Rena relies on her considerable curatorial discernment of the artist's impressive single-sheet engravings to assess her skill as a printmaker. The prints themselves also provide clues to track Quesnay's networks with important collectors whose paintings she produced in print. Chapter 8 is on Laura Piranesi, and based in archival discoveries, Rita Bernini, who's a curator in Rome, gives further narrative of Laura Piranesi's life and career. Bernini catalogs her work for the first time independently of her famous father and distinguishes Laura's own picturesque style from his. Finally, Chapter 9 is my own, and unsurprisingly, the archives and the collections at the Louis Walpole Library provide the primary research material for me to position etchings by noble women as acts of aesthetic and social currency among family and peers.
So now to part 3, which includes 6 chapters on the side of business, the market, and negotiating the law. And the first chapter of the section is chapter 10. Sheila O'Connell presents new archival findings to fill in aspects of Mary Darley's life and the importance of her achievements as a publisher of political and social satire, including her significant publication on the principles of drawing caricatures. And we're happy to have you here to talk more about it. The next chapter, 11, is by Amy Torbert, who provides an incredible survey of several women print publishers from a range of origins, means, aesthetic interests, politics, and who had varying degrees of longevity and success. Chapter 12, My Own, which begins with Jane Hogarth's letter to a friend, Adam Walker, where she confronted the powerful biographer, John Knowles. It examines James Hogarth's engagement with copyright law as part of her considerable commercial success in continuing the business of selling her husband's prints by presenting evidence through archival research, legal documents, and newspapers' advertisements. Through her forceful words to Knowles, her convictions and her actions, as well as through satire aimed against her, the findings demonstrate that Jane Hogarth had much more than a passing or passive familiarity with her husband's output, something we found was a big commonality in the collection, and in fact suggests that she likely had an acute knowledge and involvement in their print business before William's death, but certainly after the business became solely hers. Chapter 13, building on the work of his award-winning book on James Gilray, Tim Clayton presents Hannah Humphrey as Gilray's collaborator in both business and creative aspects of his brilliant satiric prints. She has ultimately his sole publisher. Chapter 14, Nick Knowles, who identifies or has identified 90 prints by Thomas Rowlandson that were issued by women, including Elizabeth Jackson, Hannah Humphrey, Elizabeth Dashery, Elizabeth Bruhl, and Eleanor Lay. Importantly, as Knowles identifies in his essay, Rowlandson's own sister, Elizabeth Howitt, also made prints. But the chapter in particular asserts the importance of Elizabeth Jackson's great number of works. Chapter 15, the last one, through the evidence of surviving prints and historical ephemera, Alison Stagg reconstructs the contributions of two Philadelphia women to their husband's prints business. This history today, told in 15 chapters, does matter. And it brings us to the cover, which we consider a very important component of the book, designed by Lou McKeever, Lulu, a contemporary British cartoonist and graphic artist who is here with us today. In her self-portraits, we see Lulu doing what she likes most, research and studying the works of Mary Darley at the Prints and Drawings room of the British Museum. With the cover, we meant to stress the value, role, and importance of contemporary women artists and cartoonists, because their struggles working in the field of cartoons and graphic arts persist today. Lulu has stated that the British comic scene has, quote, all the unreconstructed atmosphere of a working men's club, intimidating for a lone woman to enter, end of quote. This is the progression of the cover from the pencil drawing to the finished color version, finding inspiration in Mary Darley's A Book of Caricaturas on 59 copper plates with the principles of designing, and also Darley's comic prints of caricatures, macaronis from 1776. Lou is currently working on an illustrated narrative that will share her engagement with Mary Darley.
Okay, so to sum up, the combined knowledge, accumulative energy, insights, sorry, thank you, Cristina. See, I can't do without her. An amazing new research of 15 authors, among them curators, academics, scholars, students, and collectors, bring multiple perspectives and diverse research methods that have uncovered new biographical details, recount opportunities and obstacles, assess printmaking skills, and demonstrate remarkable acumen in the business of prints. Collectively, the research of many produces a richer, more complex narrative about the vital contributions of women across nations and across social and economic classes. You can probably tell I really like collaboration. The undeniable truth is that women did actively participate in printmaking and selling. And the fruits of this collective research nicely disrupt conventional values about the exclusion of women from printmaking, print selling, and publishing. They were always there, hidden in plain sight, or where we started, underneath the male family members. So, echoing Esther Chadwick's brilliant new book, The Radical Print, is there not still something radical about moving the contributions of women who made prints, sold prints, and published prints from the margins to the center of art history as well? Thank you.
Do I just move this across, Christina? Yeah, there we are. Hi, everyone. I'm just timing myself because usually I go over. Hello, my name's Hannah. I'm the curator of the University of Reading's art collection. But when I first met Cristina and Cindy, which feels like a lifetime ago now, I was writing my PhD thesis, which in the end focused on professional women printmakers who lived and worked within family workshops in the late 18th and early 19th century. That was a collaborative doctoral award with the V&A and Birkbeck, where I was supervised by the wonderful Kate Retford in the History of Art department and Dr. Sarah Grant, who's curator of prints at the V&A. And I remember the call for papers for your conference, and I just started the thesis, and Kate really had to talk me down off the ledge because I had nothing to contribute, but I was so desperate to be there and be part of this conversation. So as Cindy and Cristina have said, my chapter in the imprint is a broad account of the experiences of the printmakers' family homecoming workshop in the late 18th, early 19th century, focusing on the role and status of women within these families and spaces. And it weaves some micro case studies throughout this chapter too. And these have largely been taken from my thesis. So sometimes tonight I might talk interchangeably about the two. So we were asked to very quickly talk about our research methods and our process. And I should say that when I started in 2017, the first thing I did, there's a small image there of David Alexander's publication, Caroline Watson and Female Printmaking. So I reviewed all of the secondary literature, including David's really important body of work on women printmakers. So though this exhibition catalogue, which I think was also funded by the Paul Mellon Centre, though this focused on Caroline Watson, there was also an appendices at the back which gave information about some of these printmakers. I also consulted, the big feminist art historical texts, dictionaries of art. There were long days in the National Art Library combing through all of these dictionaries and the print dictionaries too, of course. And there was a very pertinent footnote in Anne Sutherland Harris's and Linda Nocklin's famous women artists catalogue, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, from 1976, which actually was very revealing in 2017 too. And they said in a footnote, "My files contain the name of about 90 women known to have made prints before 1800, but very little is known of them, and practically no serious research has been carried out on them, for whom a sufficient number of works and adequate documentation are known to make further study rewarding." So I, had consulted the secondary literature. I then threw myself into looking at the prints themselves. That's all right. I thought it was background noise coming from the computer. I was very lucky in that I was based in London, and the great benefit of the CDP was that I was basically a member of staff at the V&A, so I was able to go into the prints and drawings room, sift through the prints, and work in the National Art Library. I benefited enormously from so many colleagues in this room today. Sheila, Stephen, so many of you who I was contacting about my research, who were emailing me and saying, "Have you looked into this archive?" or "Have you looked at this library?" or "Have you come and seen this in the collection?" And gradually, I started to realise that there were a lot of women. And Paris, I remember in your book, you said you had that moment in the Royal Academy where you realised, oh, okay, I have to put pen and paper down and move to the computer and create a database. And I absolutely had that moment. So you can see just a little snapshot there of the database that I started to compile. So I had to get very intimate with Excel quite quickly. I'm still not sure I've quite mastered it, but that allowed me to start thinking about, these women and their and where their prints were, and really trying to get to grips with this huge mass of information. The next step, when I had, names, tombstone information, it would be things like Jane Smith, 18th century, etching. I then started to take advantage of genealogical websites, so became very familiar with Ancestry and Find My Past, and really doing basic archival research, trying to figure out who these women were, who they were related to, where they lived, and that, again, fed into the database. And then I started, of course, making in-person trips to the London Archives, to Kew, looking at parish records, baptism records, death records, wills, probates, travelling further afield to look at diaries and letters where they survived, if they did survive. Those were quite far and few between. And ultimately, that fed into the heart of the thesis, which focused on, as I said, professional women printmakers. I took quite a traditional biographical account throughout the thesis, and that was to truly understand the life cycle and ask questions such as, who were these women? Where did they live? How were they trained? What techniques were they working in? What genres were they working in? And I felt that I had to create this really solid base in order to take this research further. But what I hope it's done is not only shed a light on women printmakers, but also the mechanisms of the trade more broadly and how men and women work together in these workshops. So I think that's my 5 minutes.
To lower the tone of this. Right. I'm going to show 2 prints to illustrate a comment in by Dorothy George, the great historian of English satirical prints. She credited Mary Darley and her husband Matthias with the transition that outmoded the traditional emblematical print and prepared the way for Gilray and Rowlandson. In the 1770s, they dominated the print-selling world with caricatures. Sorry, I thought you were just with caricatures in the newest manner. So that's in the 1770s. Cindy and Cristina asked us to talk about our sources and how we coped with research during the COVID pandemic. I relied, of course, on what had been published about the Darleys, but it tends to be rather patchy. A lot of people mention them, but in between more general accounts of printmaking and print publishing at the time. What I wanted to do was to look at newspaper advertisements. And I started, luckily, just before COVID struck, systematically going through the British Library's burning newspapers, digitised by Gale. There are huge numbers of advertisements for the Darley prints, not just the satires, which was my main interest, but a vast range of other kind of prints, including a lot which mentioned Mary's name. There were things like message cards for the different degrees of nobility and ladies' stencils for painting silks, etc. So very genteel sort of subjects, which you wouldn't really expect looking at this print. The other useful digital source was Ancestry.com, of course, which was available free of charge during COVID, which was rather nice. I was able to find a lot of biographical material there, which hadn't been dug out before, I don't think. And it included the image of the marriage register, which sort of flashed through on the screen earlier. How that helped was to give me Mary's handwriting. She signed her name. And that meant I could match that handwriting with the hand on a number of the prints, including the one I'm showing here. You can see that she wasn't a trained lettering engraver. The writing is not exactly elegant. The next print I'm going to show in a couple of minutes has the sort of lettering that Matthias, her husband, would have provided, and he'd had a formal apprenticeship. This print is one of a large number of attacks on the Prime Minister, Lord Bute. Although it doesn't carry the name of a printmaker or publisher, it appears under Mary's name in an advertisement of September 1762, which was a very early stage in her career. This was one of those periods when political satire boomed. The young George III and Prime Minister Bute were attempting to bring an end to what became known as the 7 Years' War. It was an unpopular move. Military successes had boosted trade, and there was a fear that the newly acquired colonies would be lost to other powers. It was risky to attack the king directly, but Bute was an easy target. Like satirists of all times, Mary and others did anything they could to dream up how they could attack him. His Scottish nationality was stressed, and he was accused of giving preference to his countrymen. He was supposed to be taking bribes from the Spanish, the Dutch and the French, the rival powers. And it was said that he only got his job as Prime Minister because he was the lover of Princess Augusta, the King's mother. We don't know whether that was true or not. This print is very much what Dorothy George called the traditional emblematical print. On the left is William Hogarth, who supported moves towards a peace treaty. He's painting an image of a boot, the emblem for Lord Bute. Nice pun. Hogarth carries his own emblem on his palette, the Line of Beauty, and he's dressed emblematically in tartan. Bute was a Scot. Then we have three figures representing rival powers, again represented emblematically. A Spaniard in 16th century dress as a reminder of the Spanish Armada, a portly Dutchman in breeches, and an elegant Frenchman with a long queue at his hairstyle. They all prepare to kiss the arse of Lord Bute, who's lifted his kilt, and is himself bending forward to where Princess Augusta has lifted her skirts. According to Mary's advertisement, the print was designed by a lady, unnamed, of course. You're meant to laugh, good. Dorothy George mentioned that in the 1770s, the Dalis were selling caricatures, meaning literally caricatures, the images where physical features were exaggerated. In fact, in 1762, Mary published the first how-to book with about 60 pages of caricatures, stressing that this was a manner of drawing that was and still is held in great esteem by the Italians and French. Some of our nobility and gentry at this time do equal, if not excel, anything of the kind that has ever been done before. You'll have noticed that there's a continual stress on the high status of those involved. Now, do I just press this? Oh, I can see what I do. Yeah? Yes, good. This is, are we there? Yeah. This is one of about 150 macaroni prints that the Dalis published between 1771 and 1773. Each shows an identifiable person as a macaroni, the name that had been coined for wealthy young men returning from the Grand Tour in Italy with fancy ideas. It became a general term to mock fashionable people. This macaroni is Joseph Banks, in his 20s and already on his way to becoming the country's leading naturalist. He'd recently returned from Captain Cook's first round-the-world voyage with hundreds of plant and animal specimens, but here he is made fun of as a butterfly hunter. The prints were about A5 size, this sort of size, and sold for 6pence plain, 1 shilling coloured. And you could buy them in bound volumes of 24 prints at 9 shillings or 15 shillings. That's quite expensive. They were a huge success. And many designs for them were provided by gentlemen and ladies. They were advertised as such, just like the print we saw before. This was a clever marketing ploy. The fact that these women were clever at marketing their prints as well as making them is a point that's already been made. So this clever marketing employ encouraged interest in collecting satirical prints. Collectors were attracted not only by the subjects, mockery of well-known characters, but also by the social status of the designers. One very status-conscious collector of macaroni prints was Horace Walpole. He annotated a macaroni print in his collection, which was entitled The Female Connoisseur. The print is actually in the British Museum now, and he identified the subject as Mary Darley herself. The fact that he named her is evidence of just how celebrated she was.
And moving swiftly on, I suppose I've been working on printmakers and printsellers like Sheila for quite a long period of time, and I produced a book in the 1980s called The English Print, which was essentially the product of questions I was asking about why prints were made, who bought them, what was done with them, and to try to establish the networks of people who were involved in the creation of these things. I'd always been interested in Gillray and got the chance to do the same thing in detail with Gillray, thanks to the Paul Mellon Centre, and wrote what was ostensibly a biography, but there's very, very little biographical material on Gillray. There's a collection of papers in the British Library and a bit more of the same in New York Public Library, and not an awful lot else, except what you can put together from the prints themselves and the drawings that exist. But one way of getting at Gillray is to work through his publishers. And fortunately, William Holland was a much more outward and expressive personality. He produced millions and millions of advertisements as raw material. Samuel William Fore was also very keen on advertising. But the most important of Gillray's publishers, with whom he eventually settled down in what was certainly a business relationship. It's not very clear what their other relationship might have consisted of, but they were very, very close friends at the very least. And Gillray was regarded as part of Hannah Humphrey's family. And Hannah, who also frustratingly didn't advertise very much, at least not in the obvious way. But Hannah's family suddenly produced an enormous insight into Gillray's life, because her father had a shell workshop in St Martin's Lane where he sold shells, and he bought a lot of the shells that came back with Captain Cook on his voyage from the world round the world, and the patronage overlaps significantly because Sarah Banks is a key buyer both of shells and natural history and of prints, and is one of Hannah's main customers. And Hannah's elder sister Elizabeth became a key, ran the mineralogy shop in London of the world's leading mineralogist, a guy called Jacob Forster. So the Humphrey family produced a network, an interlinked network of curiosity shops. All these shell specialists are selling the odd print. Print specialists are selling minerals and shells, and you get a picture of this interlinked world of patronage. There's quite a lot of letters out there, and mostly I discovered them after COVID and couldn't go and study them, and still haven't. But so I was trying to build up Hannah's network a little. It became clear that Gillray, this is Gillray reproducing a drawing by one of Hannah's key customers, who has been Hannah's customer, has been supplying drawings to Hannah in the same way that people supplied drawings to Mary Darley for publication. So they supplied drawings to Hannah. I sometimes suspect that I've got absolutely no evidence that Hannah might have worked with Mary Darley before she set up her own shop. But certainly from the moment that she sets up shop, she's working in the same way that Mary Darley is, cultivating people who will bring her designs. And interestingly, it's a number of women who are bringing her designs. Most of them have got names that I can't work out. There's somebody called Agnes, name starts with T and ends in N. This one is Valentina Ainscombe, who we do know a little bit about. She was the daughter of a very wealthy man who was one of the managers of the Sunfire Insurance, lived in a big house in Mortlake, and she and her sisters were trained by cousins in drawing. But some of the earlier drawings are actually signed VA, so I think we know that it's Valentina Ainscombe rather than Charlotte Ainscombe. And this one is helpfully annotated on the back of the British Museum's copy that came from Sarah Banks with the name of the person who designed it. And I think it's pretty clear. Sarah Banks is buying from Hannah, as we know from the British Museum's collection, from the moment that Hannah sets up. So is Valentina. You just begin to be able to put together a few patterns. Can we, since you've got the flicker, but it's all so very frustrating and so very difficult. Everybody knows that the old lady in this picture is Hannah Humphrey. I don't think it is. The evidence is actually just simply not there. There are about 4 or 5 commentaries on the print. It is only the last one in Wright and Evans that identifies the lady as Hannah Humphrey. The 1830 reprint of Gilray's works that was produced by George Humphrey, who should have known, says that the identity of the lady is unknown, which is probably just discretion, but nevertheless. And earlier on in 1824, you get the assertion that this is a lady and her German husband. Well, the figure on the right with the ace of spades is certainly Betty, Hannah Humphrey's servant. The figure on the left is certainly Richard Mortimer, an art dealer who was a close friend of Elizabeth Humphrey. And Elizabeth Humphrey is married to a German. There are various identifications that give this figure as a German. Anyway, I suspect that that may be Hannah's sister Elizabeth, but it's just there's still so much to be dug out there and discovered, and I'll stop there.
Good evening. So I've been trying to understand Rowlandson's overall printmaking career, and my chapter in the book investigates a rather curious fact that in the first 10 years of his career, he had over 30% of his prints were published by women publishers, but by the end of his career, there are almost none, and if you say lifetime, is only about 3% of his prints are published by women. But what I'm going to pick out this evening is really the 2 new discoveries I've made that I've written up in this chapter that I think of quite interest, and then also sort of show the sort of way I've been approaching research. The first one concerns Elizabeth Jackson, who's a printseller with premises in Golden Square, just north of Piccadilly. As with a lot of the other women, very little is known about her, not least because Samuel Fors, the big print dealer and seller, bought up most of her plates when she went out of business and replaced her imprint with his imprint, so a lot of her prints have previously been credited to him, when in fact they were actually originally published by Elizabeth. If you look in the BM online catalogue, you'll find just only 30 prints from Jackson by Rowlandson. But if you look worldwide, you'll find 63, including several states that had never been previously attributed to her. Of course, the fact that you can do this is really just, I think, shows how game-changing the digitalization work that the major museums have been doing in the past 20 years, enabling one to ask questions and make comparisons about stuff in a way you could never really realistically do before. And of course, we should be thanking Sheila and Cindy and Connie, if she's here, for the fantastic work that they've been doing that. But it really does enable a completely different approach, and you want to be much more ambitious about some of the questions you try to answer. And I even found one impression in the government art catalogue of a print that's mentioned in Grego but hasn't been seen since, hanging on the wall of the British Embassy in Berlin, just to show the value of being able to look at stuff online. Of course, as when Martin raised an eyebrow at my computer background earlier on, I am quite comfortable with searching through stuff and going into obscure places on the internet, and also cataloguing the data, which is an important part of the approach. But another question you can ask with the digital data available is just how important was Rowlandson for Elizabeth Jackson? So we know that she was important for him. But if you look at her output, you find, and this has really surprised me, Rowlandson really accounts for the large majority of her prints. I mean, there's only a handful, about 7 prints, 2 by Gilray, a couple by other artists, that aren't by Rowlandson in terms of the prints that she published. She's probably selling other Printsellers prints with their imprints, but it kind of means that he was her star artist, and she's sort of kind of, the main big investment by her, and she's probably an important influencer for promoting him. But I also always try and, as well as looking stuff online, I make a point of trying to visit different collections everywhere. And quite often you can find exhibits of evidence that you can help you piece together the picture. And there's a particularly interesting wrapper I found in the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, where there's a very big collection of interesting British prints, a lot of which were collected in the SARS time. So it's a really fascinating collection. And in this, there's this wrapper here that, if you look, that's got 12 prints issued by Jackson. And I'll just pick out 3 really interesting points about them. The first one is, if you look at the frontispiece, that's the same print that's used for the Humphrey's History of the Westminster Election, which was published in 1784, except she's changed the lettering. And so instead of saying Liberty and Fame introducing, I've forgotten, in Liberty and Fame introducing Britannia to female patriotism. Instead of saying introducing female patriotism, she's changed it to introducing a female artist to Britain, which is sort of bang on the mark for Cindy's book. The second point that's interesting to note is this print of battlements up on the right. So during this period, Rowlandson was producing a series of sort of reproductive prints after contemporary artists like Gainsborough and Wheatley and so on. Jeffreys is a slightly older contemporary of Rowlandson's at the Royal Academy, did the drawing for that. And so the only other impression of this is in the Met in New York, and it doesn't have the Jackson's imprint on it. But here we've got it clearly labelled with her imprint in 1786. And that's really interesting because it probably suggests that Jackson was published not just, well, may have been quite significantly involved in the publication of the imitations. Most of these prints, reproductive prints, don't have any imprinted at all. They just have the artist's name and maybe a year in the plate. The year usually being the year the drawing was done, not the year the plate was done. And the last point to note is that if you look at on the top, it says number 1. So as if this was part of a planned series of issuing. And of course, wrappers often get thrown away, so there may well have been more prints in the series. Then the second discovery, which I want to go to on the next slide, thank you, is this one here. And this concerns Rowlandson's younger sister, Elizabeth, who married one of his best friends, Samuel Parrott, in 1799. So she was married to an artist, must have seen all the printmaking processes. But the marriage went sour and they separated in about 1800, at which point Rowlandson set her up as a print dealer. But it looks like she was also making caricatures. My sort of breakthrough moment with this came when I was visiting the National Gallery in Washington, and they've got this 6-volume collection of prints, mostly Rowlandson, that was collected by a Victorian collector called Sir William Augustus Fraser. And I came across this print, which isn't digitized yet, so you can't see it online, and it's actually got Elizabeth Howitt's name as the author on it. And you can see she's got this rather peculiar, slightly charming style, very sort of naive, with a scratchy hatching and this rather erratic, wonky lettering. And the print is very clearly after a Rowlandson drawing, and there's also actually a Rowlandson print after the drawing that's was published in World in Miniature, an Ackman production in 1816. So we've got the sort of smoking gun, yes, she made a caricature. And that then prompted me to go back through a lot of the other collections. Whenever I visit a collection, I try and take a photo of everything I see, because often years later, you want to make a connection, come back to it. And of course, that's actually another of the major enabling things that's changed the way one researches is cheap digital cameras. You can take thousands and thousands of photographs, file them away, and then make use of them later. So anyhow, I then realized that there were a number of prints elsewhere. There's one in the Royal Collection, which is digitized it's actually a print after Rowlandson drawing after Hogarth. There's one in the Lewis Walpole Library, and there's several others, and I've even got a couple I found in print shops myself. So I'm up to about 6 prints, definite, and probably about 3 possibles on that. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. Firstly, thank you to Cindy and to Cristina and all of your wonderful authors for rendering such an amazing service. This is going to be a phenomenal resource for us and an incredible jumping off point for future research. I mean, just for one thing, I'm struck just how brilliant it is to have all these footnotes gathered into one place. It's just going to be so useful. So thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to respond to the book and to read it. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite details from the history of British printmaking, from Gilray's Shakespeare Sacrifice, or The Offering to Avarice, which was published in 1789. And the detail that interests me is this one on the left here, showing the painter attempting to keep an engraver, both in the guise of little sort of street urchins, out of the magic circle of art, because the line that you see in which the print publisher John Boydell is standing in is inscribed in Greek inside it. The words that, adapted from Plato's library, adorned the door to the great room of the Royal Academy. Let no stranger to the muses enter here. So essentially, the painter is saying engravers don't deserve to belong in the realm of high art. Whatever else this detail is about, it encapsulates a basic point about print's marginalization from the history of art. Printmakers in 18th century Britain, this image reminds us, were already operating in an exclusionary world. When we talk about women printmakers, are we not then dealing with a double marginalization and thus potentially the need for a double recovery? Now, yeah. Consider this well-known image of an early modern print workshop. It's sort of become one of the images of early modern printmaking. It oozes masculine energy. It says, this is a space for men. This book, which deals, of course, not just with women printmakers, but women who sold and published prints too, as we've heard, both examines the notion of women's exclusion and, at the same time, challenges it. Because, as we've been hearing, women can be found working in just about every aspect of the print world in the 18th century, even if in much smaller numbers than men. This groundbreaking collection of essays reminds us and greatly deepens our knowledge about the fact that women were absolutely vital to the business of making and selling prints in 18th century Europe. Shakespeare Sacrificed is a case in point, because its publisher was Hannah Humphrey, with whom, as we've heard from Tim Clayton, Gilray worked from 1780 and exclusively from 1791. She was responsible for publishing many of Gilray's most impressive satires, and they really made their names together. And an important model for Gilray's print was surely this one on the left, Caroline Watson's stipple engraving after Robert Edge Pine's Garrick Speaking the Jubilee Ode. Watson, as Heather Macpherson shows in her chapter, was at the centre of the London art world in the mid-1780s when this print was made. She was one of the engravers employed on Boydell's Shakespeare Gallery project, which is the sort of ostensible target of Gilray's satire. And encountering the many links between and among the people discussed in these chapters gave me the urge to create kind of network maps. This is just a tiny sort of back of an envelope fragment of the beginnings of a possible map. And I feel like the whole book could eventually be mapped and everybody would link up in some way. So what we're looking at here, you've got Watson working for Boydell on the Shakespeare Gallery. These are just possible links. There are many, many others that I could point out. Kaufman also working for Boydell on the Shakespeare Gallery. You've got Printsellers coming from Germany to work for Boydell. You've got Mary Darley in that print that Sheila mentioned might be a portrait of Darley, who's an important model for Humphrey. You've also got Susanna Sledge, who's also whose print selling business is also a really important model for Humphrey. And just in passing, I think, given that we're looking at Sledge's wonderful mezzotint that she published after Reynolds' portrait of Mai, the Pacific Islander, it's a rather wonderful, tantalizing connection to Humphrey's world of exotic shells and so on, a key context for which was of course Cook's voyages. So this is a sort of fragment of that interlinked world that Tim talked about and that I think has been coming through really beautifully in the talks this evening. If the names of Humphrey, Watson, and particularly Kaufman are relatively familiar, correlating with their successes in their own lifetimes, there are many others whose lives and works are rescued by this book from near oblivion. These are successive trade cards of the Griffin family business of Printsellers. And you can see in this series, or just about, I hope, how Peter Griffin on the far left the map and print seller, is then replaced by his mother, Anne Griffin. And then Elizabeth Griffin. And then after Hester Griffin, who's Elizabeth's daughter, marries an engraver named Michael Jackson. It's Jackson's name that now appears on the third version of the print, which is in turn replaced by that of Hester's second husband, George Pulley. Now, we know that, thanks to this chapter by Amy Torbert, we know that Hester advertised herself as a print seller, but her presence and role in the business goes unrecognized by these cards. Her name doesn't appear in print. As Amy Torbert details, Hester Griffin was subsumed under other names, first her brother's, Peter's, then her mother's, and finally her two husbands. We might compare this fate to a woman operating in a rather different world in Italy, Laura Piranesi, who etched many Roman vedute, but was written out of early Piranesi biographies and has been almost entirely eclipsed by the name of her famous father. Rita Bernini's essay in the book is a good example of how the scholars brought together here are really working at the archival coalface, doing that painstaking work of recovering overlooked biographical details, as well as actually reattributing prints to their rightful makers. All the women in the book worked in the context of strong normative expectations about the role of women and girls in the home and society. Hannah Lyons, in her essay, has a striking account of how the engraver sisters Anne and Jane Taylor had to alternate their labour between their father's workroom — they were trained as engravers by their father — between their father's workroom and their mother's domestic realm below stairs. And they would be alternately designated supra, the one working above, and infra, the one working below. The stark gendering of space and society in this period could also be mapped onto the gendering of print techniques themselves. As Heather Macpherson reminds us, stipple engraving, or the so-called dotted manner, something with which Caroline Watson, and these are just examples of Watson's work here, including a proof print that shows you her midway through making one of her stipples, something that she became synonymous with. But it was attacked by critics as inferior, lacking vigour, and propelled by fashion and degenerate taste. This was a view, by the way, that was shared by William Blake. In this context, it's perhaps not surprising that women sought to make links with other women. As Tim Clayton points out, Hannah Humphrey stipulated in her will that the legacies granted to her female relatives should be for their exclusive use, independent of their husbands. And it's possible to detect a practice of what Hannah describes as gendered networking, in which there might be an acknowledgement or an assumption of women's ideas, labour, and tastes as something shared. So we've already seen a plate from this series, which is an example of what we might call a kind of all-women project, with prints by Caroline Watson, after Mariah Cosway, and appended verses by Mary Robinson. And the subject of the series is women, poor and affluent women, alternating. Or you have Catherine Cousinet in the chapter by Rena Hoisington, etching these pendant paintings, which were owned by a woman, Marguerite Lecomte. And across the Atlantic, in the only chapter that moves beyond Europe, in early 19th century Philadelphia, we find Eliza Cox Aiken making this vignette for the membership certificate of the Newburyport Female Charitable Society, engraved, as Alison Stagg puts it, by a woman for a woman. But Kelsey Martin, in her chapter on two sets of printmaker sisters working in Paris, cautions against the temptation to ascribe a simple group consciousness to women in the print trade. Indeed, what's really striking in this volume is its enormous range and the sheer variety of genres, of markets, and crucially, of social classes that it encompasses. As my mini map earlier began to suggest, we need to see this world as highly relational. So if networks is one key idea that continually asserts itself through these pages, another is collaboration. And that's already come out loud and clear this evening. I can't think of a single instance in the book where somebody is working alone to produce an image singular to them. I mean, the rare printed self-portraits of people like Kaufmann or Anna Maria de Wilde, discussed by Madeleine Villion in the opening chapter, are probably the exceptions that prove that rule. When it comes to early modern print, we require a different model of authorship from the one that has been promoted traditionally by art history, a model of distributed authorship and agency that centers relations between producers rather than privileging the singular individual. And I'm not saying by any means that we need to abandon the project of recovering the life and work of individual women. That's obviously important to that project. This book is so valuable because in effecting the double recovery required by women in the print world, it allows that more complex, nuanced and intersectional picture to come into view. So thank you.
I'm returning to the stand at this point because we do have time now, about 20 minutes, for questions, comments, observations, either for individual panelists or for the panel as a whole. And they can come from the room, those of you here, and they can, I believe, be entered online as well, if you're watching online, using the Q&A function, and that can be fed through to us. So shall we just open it to the floor? Because it's a full house. If not, I can make a start by making an observation, which, but then we'll move over here, about, and what the other panelists would comment on this, that the theme of the digital transformation of scholarship came up, I think I counted at least 3 times, maybe 4 times across the presentations. And I wonder if I could elicit some further thoughts about how this kind of this project of historical recovery, has it been driven peculiarly by the possibilities of digitization, or was it going to happen anyway?
It's going to happen anyway.
And if you could take the microphone when you do answer. Yeah.
I think it was going to happen anyway, but I think it's actually got a lot further to run, because if you, I mean, at the moment you primarily have to search by text, of whether it's artist, subject, whatever, and that of course relies on the thing having been correctly attributed in the first place. Longer term, image, being able to search on the actual image. I mean, if you try using something like Google Lens at the moment, it's quite, it often gets it completely wrong, hopeless. It can't really pick out one frame of a picture from a surround at all well. But it occasionally comes up with some very, very interesting mishits, because what it's looking for is the certain marks being together and certain patterns of mark making. So several times I've found it actually come up with really give me a lead from what's a completely ignorant in the sense of it's got no understanding of what it's doing, but it is actually just matching on the image. But to once the image matching gets really good, as I think it will as the AI improves, then I think we're going to see a whole lot more, because you'll then start finding prints and making connections in a way that you could never really do before.
I think, we've been talking about this hierarchy of media and print being the handmaiden of painting, etc. And I think that has fed into, curatorial decision making previously. And there are still so many prints that are uncatalogued. I mean, that was why my project at the V&A came about. And as I spoke about in my talk, I relied a lot on talking to curators who had been, cataloguing and digitizing collections. But also I was talking with curators who are still in that process. And, I was desperate to get my hands on the collections at the National Trust, partly because so many of those prints are still in frames, and what can that tell us about how they were used and displayed. And, the curators from the National Trust came back to me and said, well, first we've got to catalogue all the paintings fully, then it's the sculptures, then it's the drawings, and then prints, I'm afraid, are in the distant future. So I was very reliant on, property curators and other colleagues kind of doing their own internal searches.
Yeah, there are a few caveats as well.
We search for newspaper advertisements, but they've used recognition technology to read 18th century newspapers that picks up about 60% of them, so you just don't really know unless you're using paper copies or the old reels, whether you're getting the complete thing. Searching is unreliable. What else was I going to say? Oh yes, Google digitized books, but they fail to digitize the illustrations. So there's no frontispiece, or there's no. Well, yeah, yes. And there are a lot of issues about that. Fortunately, I started my Google research while they had a whole lot more books on there than they have now. Stuff's been taken off.
I just wanted to say one little thing about the Boydell Shakespeare, and I may have got this wrong, but I seem to remember that the painters were paid less than the printmakers, certainly in some cases. Yeah, they were.
Quite a lot.
Right. Well, that says something about the status of printmakers, doesn't it?
Okay, there was a hand up. You got the microphone.
I've got the microphone. Just say, fabulous project. Thanks very much. But on terms of digital searches, one of the real problems if you work on the 18th century is the inability for Google and things to understand the 18th century S, which causes huge problems. Also, just to say how very envious I am of those of you who work on British art because of the wonderful resources of the British Museum. The Bibliothèque Nationale catalogue of prints got stuck 50 years ago at the letter L and has never proceeded. So count your lucky stars. But what I really wanted to ask is, it sounds all wonderful and fascinating. I wonder if it's not too crass. Can you make some generalizations about either, contrast between Britain, which is obviously what we've mostly been hearing about, and France, or which is obviously my area of interest, or Italy? And can you discern any patterns in, I note that thought was hilarious, Sheila, in that print was designed by a lady with all the naked bums, which again, I think shifting notions of who a lady would, and also noting that Nick was saying that early Rowlandson, lots of women publishers, later on less so. As I say, if it's not too crude, can one have some geographical or historical broad points?
I'll just make a point about the crudeness, because the fourth printer on that Elizabeth Jackson map I showed is actually an extremely rude one of a lady descending, it's Westminster election, she's descending in a balloon about to be impaled onto the obelisk in St George's Square. So I don't think there's any difference between, say, the women and their male counterparts in terms of where they were prepared to go in their content. But as far as the national thing, I think it's certainly when it comes to caricature, there's of course this huge difference in that the liberty of the press allowed you to say things you wouldn't dream of saying in any other European country, I think.
But in terms of women, practice of women, extent of women printmakers.
But extent of women printmakers, I hand this hand to someone.
I can't talk greatly to that question, Emma, but when I started the thesis and I started compiling all those names, I thought that I could also do British and French women printmakers. And so I started compiling all the French printmakers that I could find. And there were many more women printmakers in printmaking families in France than Britain.
Is it just that better recorded?
Oh, there's also these big print dynasties in France, isn't there? Which I think you talk about in English print, don't you?
Well, yeah, probably, or at least attempt to. But partly because in terms of dictionaries, the French are a little bit ahead of us, or were at that stage.
And there was a sort of much more of a centralised system, am I right?
Yeah, yes.
So a formal training much more, which means people would be recorded.
Yeah, and you also have a difference in France where you have the women who are actually exhibiting prints at the Salon in the 1790s and forward in a way that they're not doing in London. I know someone who's doing a somewhat parallel project to Hannah for France, going a little later, and she too is overwhelmed by the amount of names she has, by the intimidating prospect of trying to recover enough information to write something that's cohesive and pays tribute to these women. I think it's been a little less explored so far, but I don't think that means it's not there yet.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for these great talks, and the project is fantastic. So you've talked quite a lot about sort of networks and mapping, and I actually wanted to ask a rather literal question about mapping, and was just thinking, you may have done the work sort of collectively, but how interesting it would be to see these studios literally sort of plotted on a map to think about, because I think all the printmakers we've spoken about tonight, the British ones, were in London, and presumably there were some in the provinces as well, but just to, and I imagine that they operated in quite sort of, close physical proximity. I'm doing something at the moment, trying to do something at the moment for Turner's engravers, and also have been thinking about the project, the PhD dissertation that Rhian Addison has done with Martin, which sort of looks at just a limited number of 19th century London landscape painters' studios, and I was just thinking that kind of technology, could be, as it were, sort of mapped onto Esther's mapping as well. But did you have any sense of, how adjacent these women were, and whether there were likely, physical contact, as it were, between them as a result of these geographical adjacencies?
Well, I did a certain amount of mapping when I did the English print, although that only goes up to 1800, and you have a shift. I mean, there are people in the city, there is clusters on the Strand around Temple Bar especially. Later there's a spread towards Bond Street, and you certainly do have clusters of artists at certain points. And yeah, I mean, it's natural that people are going to meet. I mean, I was looking at the further connections. The Caroline Watson of Garrick and the Shakespeare statue is Robert H. Pine, who is published by Robert H. Pine, who did the first kind of series, the precursor to Boydell's Shakespeare, and lives just down the road from the Humphreys, and probably William Humphrey trained under him. Then similarly, Hannah Humphrey is yards away from Mary Darley. They at the very least, they must have spent time in front of each other's shops.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, in another part of my life, I'm doing a lot of work on London topography. And really, London was incredibly small and crowded until about the 1830s or so. I mean, this was built, 1770. This was on the very edge of London. So everyone was within walking distance of each other. And I mean, you wouldn't have had a print shop right in the grandest part of the West End or the grandest part of Westminster because it's too expensive. And so almost all the sort of people providing what are kind of luxury goods really were in the Soho, Charing Cross, Strand sort of area, and they all would have known each other. And I mean, there's a little bit of evidence. I don't know that anyone's done much work on this about Printsellers swapping prints, and you'll have 20 of these and I'll have 20 of those, and selling things for each other. And prints are advertised as being available in Fleet Street or in my shop in Charing Cross, and it's a huge, a small network really. Yeah.
There are other network things tying together. For example, in the case of Ronson, there's quite a strong Huguenot connection in these early things. So his aunt was a Huguenot in the Paris, but Elizabeth Datcheray was huge, probably huge, Cornell, who's who sold prints and also sold plates to Elizabeth Jackson, was a huge name. So the
it's just tempting to imagine, women's in the way that male engravers had conversazioni. I mean, it's really hard to try and recuperate those sort of gatherings because there is no more, little evidence.
We've got a question online which actually follows on and kind of extends this a little bit, so I'd like to bring this in. This is from Ben Casey. It says, thank you for this fascinating panel and wonderful book. Could the panel comment on female print-sellers or printmakers operating in provincial centres in Britain outside of London, which you were raising this point? Have they encountered them during their research, and do they extend beyond London? So it's the world beyond London.
Elizabeth, Ellen Millay is the most obvious one. Who had a smart print shop in Brighton and was friends with Fitzherbert, who was the Prince of Wales' wife, yes. Wife, and she was also had a print shop in St James for a while. And actually advertised a very interesting exhibition in 1794, where she talks about a new kind of British art, where she had Morland and Ronson and others. But her shop in Brighton, she also published prints of her, including some which she'd actually done the drawings for.
Yeah, just a reminder to hold the mics up because I think online it was needed.
So she also published and then did a joint publication with Fors of a drawing book. So certainly the where within provincial publishers.
Bath is an obvious place. Yeah, where there are women from quite early on operating.
Yeah.
Often there are sort of toy shop, print shop, bookshop overlaps, especially at the beginning. The provincial bookseller also sells prints that they get in from London, but it's the usual clusters of Edinburgh, Cambridge, Oxford, Bath, and then supplemented by Scarborough, Bath,
Newcastle.
York, Newcastle. It's spreading over and over and over. And of course, the Taylors moved out to Lavenham, isn't it?
They did.
They
But they're
actually
mainly
lived in my uncle's house.
But they're mainly sellers, aren't they, rather than publishers and printers? Let alone makers.
Yes, fan makers in Bath.
Bath, yeah. Well, it's that big market in Bath.
So I think, Sarah, did you want to come in? Yeah, there's a question there. Yeah.
I love this connected way of thinking and thinking together in the room as well. It's just wonderful to kind of think of the potential for future research, which I know is the whole point of writing this book or bringing together and then doing an event like this. But what was striking me as well about the structures of art history and the questions it makes me ask about that, because of course it's interesting to recover individual figures that we don't know so much about and add them into the mix. But really I was thinking, to really understand printmaking as a business and a way of life, it's to understand a family structure as well, that many of these women aren't operating, they're not lone figures, are they? They're working in, it seems to me anyway, often family businesses and reliant on shared labour. And it's probably a business model as well, actually financially, how it works to keep everyone fed and watered. And so I was just thinking, we the whole way in which art history is structured as a discipline is the individual and therefore the monographic, which hasn't really served printmaking very well. So thinking about families and relationships and partners, it's just prompting me to think in a different way. So thank you. But and I'd love to hear more about the family and the family business.
And it's not just the families. You've also got, prints involve an awful lot of people. The paper makers, the copper plate people, which is a big job. The printers and most printers are just printing. I mean, they're not the same people who publish them or make the prints. There's a whole network of people just involved in making the colorists.
Because what they hand out, you'd have women who were skilled at doing it, and they take home a bundle of prints, colour them up to a model, and bring them back. So there's a cottage industry for women.
I think, sadly, that does take us to time. I know that there are more questions arising in the room. I can see there are questions online which we were to capture.
Could I just be indulged with one comment? And going back to the very first question about digitization and research, because I heard Nick say that he does this quite a bit, but he also travels to the print rooms. So I just want to make a plea that we all still have to look at this stuff.
And what remains hidden in the archive and serendipitous, you find a letter, which is what got me started on this very project. The letter of Jane Hogarth was miscatalogued in a box in the Beinecke, which was a complete hunt. And it took days for me to recover it and find it. But I just also want to thank everybody for coming. And I just have a small announcement, because it's something that we wanted to highlight, and we're very thrilled that the book is now going to be in paperback. It's coming back on the 27th of March. It's also available online for free. Which were highlights for Cambridge. We're a bit saddened and frustrated about the images. We all know that they're missing in the book, but we have this exposure, and we're thrilled that people like Laura Engels, who we're very grateful, is using it as a textbook.
She's using it for a graduate student course on material lives of women. So it's already getting out there in next generation, we hope.
Well, I think that final call to return to the print room, return to the collections, actually picks up on some points which are being made online as well, that digitalisation gets you so far, but you need to see the things as well. But with that, those of us in the room are able to enjoy a glass of wine and continue these conversations next door. Those of you who are online, goodbye for now. And all of us should say a huge thank you for all our speakers this evening.